everybody from Penn and the unbelievable hospitality and love they've shared with Janice and Cynthia and Susan, who are from Detroit. And before I start, what I'm hoping we can do tonight is I'll do a presentation on the work we do in Detroit. And then my friend over here has a whole bunch of good questions. And through those questions, I'll answer more of what I'm not talking about in the presentation. Because I'd much rather hear what your questions are at this very, very important time in your history, our history, and the history of the planet. But before we start, I want to introduce my loving partner, wife, 45 years on the journey, and puts up with me, and has been someone who comes out of the women's movement in the 60s and 70s in the United States, was at Greenham Commons during the nuclear disarmament movement, does a lot of disability justice work, and is also a poet. What you'll say is an insomniac. But she has a poetry tree outside the house where she will take poems, not ones that she's written sometimes, but just put poems on a tree outside as a way for folks to stop and read something that might matter to them during their day, postal work or whatever. So she's going to share a poem, and then I'll get into this presentation.
Thank you to everybody who's been so gracious. I will say that when we were coming to Scotland, people said, the people are so nice. And now I know what they meant by nice. No one seems to be irritated by the questions that we ask. It just seemed to, and what else? And what else? So we are really grateful for those of you here who helped get Richie to the hospital and back out. So the poem that I'm going to share, not my poem, is very short, but it really speaks to something that we all need, and sometimes it's the only thing we have to get through. It's called breath. So here's the poem. Breathe, said the wind. How can I breathe at a time like this, when the air is full of the smoke of burning tires, burning lives? Just breathe, the wind said. Easy for you to say if the weight of injustice is not wrapped around your throat, cutting off all air. I need you to breathe. Say it with me. I need you to breathe. Don't tell me to be calm when there are so many reasons to be angry, so much cause for despair. I didn't say to be calm, said the wind. I said to breathe. We're going to need a lot of air to make this hurricane together. So let that remind us, and all of you engage just right now in taking in the air and releasing it, and doing that. We're doing that as one. So with that.
Thank you. And that's why for many of you, you often hear the rhetoric or the language that says, poets will lead the revolution. Not your analysis and the whole history of social revolution. Poets and artists are way ahead of us. So what I'm going to do for 15 minutes, I hope. If not, he'll cut me off. So we can get to your questions and his questions.
Wasn't it part of the gig I signed up for?
I want to start with what's on the board. The question that I've been meeting with a group of comrades for some 50 years, some consistently for 50 years, every Tuesday for 2 hours. They've changed over the years, but the question we always ask is, what time is it on the clock of the world? What time is it on the clock of our city, our country, and our social movements? We're ruled by questions. In 2010, there was a U.S. social forum. 20,000 people came to Detroit. And the questions what we raised was, another world is possible, which some of you may know about from Brazil and around the world. When it came to the United States, it says another U.S. is necessary. When it came to Detroit, because of the work we had done over the decades and the questions and discussions, we added another Detroit is happening. Okay, how does this work? Press the right button. This is my family. Very quickly, you just heard from Janice. I'm the guy in the back with the hat. The two women on this side, one is Alyssa, who just married into our family and married our daughter Emma. They're both educators. Emma's a principal of an inclusive education school in Boston, a public school. And Alyssa's a high school teacher of kids who come in from other countries. And Micah is our son who has an intellectual disability. And his story is an amazing story, and you should look up his name. And there's a film about him, as well as other people, about inclusive education. And with a quote 40 IQ, he's a teaching assistant at the School of Education at Syracuse University. Let me see if I pressed the right button. Okay, we'll skip. I'll tell you who this is. You can look at him. This gentleman is Vincent Harding. And he's giving a talk for about 3 minutes that says, I'm a citizen of a country that does not yet exist. And then he challenges young people. And he was one of the leaders of the freedom movement. He was the best friend of Martin Luther King, lived next door to Martin Luther King in the South. So Vincent Harding was a dear friend. He passed recently, and a comrade of ours. And he wrote the speech, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Our Silence, which was given in 1967 when Martin Luther King came out against the war in Vietnam. And what that meant was from 1955 to 1967, which was focused pretty much on the freedom movement in the South, the Montgomery bus boycott. So some 12 years after that movement, he took on the President of the United States, who had supported the Vietnam War and supported civil rights at that point as well. He had the courage to do something that was totally unpopular, which was take on the President of the United States, who had just signed a statement calling for desegregation and civil rights laws in the United States. This one is up here because I think it would be totally remiss not to talk about the international solidarity that's happening all over the world now, on a level beyond Vietnam, but not totally new to all of us, especially anybody that's got some gray hair. What I mean by that is, you had France 1968, where the country was shut down. The US movement in the United States in 68 had 3 million African Americans rebel against the US government in every city in the country. And what we see in Palestine now is 35,000 people have been killed. We know it's genocide, and the world is speaking out in a way that it hasn't spoken out. And part of it because of social media, part of it because enough is enough with what's taking place, with the pain and the crisis of wars and the militarism of the United States, of a multi-billion, trillion-dollar budget, and its support for Israel. So we're seeing things in the United States and around the world around Palestine. And this is a delegation that went from Detroit to Puerto Rico with the Palestinians, with black activists, to have a delegation of conversations in Puerto Rico. And it's part of the work that the Boggs Center is doing right now as we sort of do much more international connections, local to local. So I want to say that we live in an era of racial capitalism that's facing collapse. It's an end of an epoch in human history. It's not just a call from the 20th century ideologies, from capitalism to socialism. It's something far beyond that. That we and I'm only going to talk for what I'm doing. I'm not going to try to, I have no understanding of what takes place in your land, in your country. I have enough trouble understanding what happens in my small city of Detroit, let alone the United States. So what I say is from my experience, from my thinking, my questions. And for those of you who have watched the film of Grace Lee Boggs, Evolution of an American Revolutionary, She's standing in front of this Packard automotive plant that was built in 1905, so 120 years ago, that's still standing, but it's a remnant of what it once was. It's just an empty building. And how many of you have watched the film? Just a few of you, okay. So in the very beginning, she's pushing her walker up to this building, and she says, "I feel sorry for anybody who doesn't live in Detroit." And you say, how can someone say this? Why would you feel sorry for some, but and then she says, I feel sorry for anybody who doesn't live in Detroit, because we have the privilege of seeing giants fall. When you see giants fall, you can imagine what could come next. Or have many imaginations of what could come next. And that's a lot what the Boggs Center is about. What is the vision? What are some visions? What are some alternatives? What are some questions that out of this collapse of Western culture that started way back with your enclosures in your mother country up there and south of you, right? The south of you, England, right? And the birth of the slave trade, the burning of women as witches, the use of the land no longer as stewardship, but as a place to be resourced for economic goods, the birth of economic man and woman, the concept that knowledge is power, rather than knowledge, our head, our heart, and our hand, are what really makes us human. So we've had 600 years. So if we think we're going to end racial capitalism and white supremacy and nation statism and all that in the next 6 weeks or 6 months, we're missing what the struggle's about. Doesn't mean we don't do everything we can to reduce the harm or the pain, but if folks want to call themselves revolutionaries, or as Angela Davis recently said in an interview, and I think many of you probably know the name Angela Davis. She says, I'm trying to be a revolutionary. She didn't used to say that. She didn't used to say that. Right? And there's a wonderful discussion between Grace and Angela when Grace was alive. So I want to start there because we see we're at the end of an epoch. We're not just at the end of a certain stage of capitalism. A whole Western way of thought is coming to an end. Start with the 1967 rebellion in Detroit, 2 events. Rebellion in Detroit and that speech I mentioned by Martin Luther King. 67 was the rebellion in Detroit, and I want to be very clear, we call it a rebellion, not a riot, because it was the highest form of protest and movement building after some 12 years of the movement emerging from the South. What caused it? 300 years of enslavement, 100 years of Jim Crow, and the continued police barbarism, the continued lynchings that took place throughout the 20th century. People thought that would lead to a revolution because it would meant for the first time in history black folks were standing up, and when they stood up, the whole of America would shake and collapse, and a new world would happen. Guess what? I don't think you have to guess, because 50 years later, it didn't happen. Capitalism redefined itself, right? The 80s, you have Thatcher, we have Reagan, we have neoliberalism, blah, 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 blah. And what it meant for Jimmy and Grace Boggs and for the Boggs Center is they had to make a distinction between rebellion and revolution. A rebellion is a rejection, a high level of protest. It's a rejection of injustices. A revolution is a projection of where you want to go, and the need to change yourself, to change yourself to what kind of human beings do we need to become to be the kind of leadership that's necessary to bring in a visionary change. And that was 1968, and so Jimmy and Grace sort of had this conversation, and they review their entire work of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. That was in 67. As I said, 3 million black Americans stood up and rebelled in 1968 in the United States, right? How does it compare to the 24 million people that protested George Floyd's murder around the world? Well, different, but these are pretty big numbers. And then the Beyond Vietnam speech in 67, and we have not answered that question. And that's why the t-shirt over here says revolution with an E, called evolution. We haven't answered that question. That question is a continuous. We're not trying to prove a theory of revolution. We're trying to evolve a new theory for the practice that we experience and the thinking that has advanced. The other 1967 turning point was beyond Vietnam speech. In that speech, Martin Luther King says, we need to struggle against the evil triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism. And if he lived today, he would be saying patriarchy, environmental destruction, and ableism. And then he said we need a radical revolution of values. So those two questions, what is a radical revolution of values, what does a revolution mean for this moment in history, were questions we didn't answer in '67. And we still need to answer them within each crisis that emerges. Okay, let's go. All right, let's move. So that's the foundation. So the other part of that, so while we were doing work in Detroit, from 1967 to today and continuing, we've experienced a new movement within the world. From Arab Spring to Standing Rock to Occupy Wall Street to the Me Too movement to the immigration rights movement to the disability movement, gay, lesbian, transgender movements, new union organizing being revitalized. You know, the whole global movement to deal with the planetary crisis, the extinction movement, and so forth. And then Black Lives Matter, and most recently the Palestinian movement. Okay, is that right? Okay, there it is. So in 1992, after a lot of different kinds of political work, we started something called Detroit Summer. And that was a gathering of young people to rebuild, respirit, and redefine Detroit from the ground up. It involved bringing high school and college age young people to Detroit to be involved in 1992 to urban gardens, to do intergenerational conversations, to do youth conversations, to do murals, to do create parks, to create new education discussion. What is the purpose of education? To deal with how do you create safety in the community. Right? A lot of stuff that has now become much more common around the United States. And from our conversations with people in different parts of the world, this conversation is taking place everywhere. But that was 1992. And it wasn't a coincidence that it was the same 2 years later as when the Zapatistas in Chiapas rise up and say it's enough, it's time to get rid of 40 years of leftist organizing that they had during '68 in Mexico and say let's create something new. Okay, so there's a few people here. There's a picture of Jimmy Boggs. There's a young woman named Julia Putnam, who we met when she was 16. What I want to give you a sense is that our relationships, our critical connections, the people we've met, have continued to grow, to emerge as leaders within their communities, within their work. Julia, wearing the orange shirt here, was 16 years old when we met her in 1992. She's now the principal of an elementary school named James and Grace Lee Boggs School, where the kids wear t-shirts that say we are solutionaries, and where they go and march through the community saying critical thinking is good and we're critical thinkers. Okay? The theme of the school is our ultimate end must be the creation of the beloved community. That's on their website. James and Grace Lee Boggs Center, the vision is up there. And I'll send folks, anybody who wants some of this information. But our mission essentially is to nurture community leadership for the transformation and revitalization of reimagining our city and our world. And what that means to me is the mission we have is threefold. One is uplifting what we call visionary organizing, where people are creating the future now, not waiting to create the future after socialism. We're doing it now. However, this mass revolution emerges at some point, we will be more prepared than not to have some new forms, new relationships, new organizations, new institutions created. The second is networking is really important. And the third is our questions are more important than the answers. This is Jimmy and Grace Boggs. Jimmy is born in 1919, born in Alabama, where he clearly left in 1939 when he was 20, because he would, best way to sum it up is where white people were gentlemen and ladies by day and Ku Klux Klans by night. And they would lynch someone or harass some black person enough so that black folks knew how to act, which has never changed in America. The expression of it has changed, but it's the same intimidation. And he was an organic intellectual. He wrote a book called The American Revolution, 1963. And Grace Boggs lived to be, he died in 1993. Grace Boggs was born in 1915 and died 100 years and 100 days. So that's 2015 plus a few days. And she was educated at Bryn Mawr College in the elite universities in philosophy. Ran around with C.L.R. James and Raya Dianevsky for all those leftists that want to go back in the history of Jimmy and Grace, which would be a fun conversation. These are some of the books that I'm going to leave with folks from the team here for all the work. And then the first book being this American Revolution by Jimmy. And there's collected writings. The latest book by Grace was The American Revolution. It's the same, the next American Revolution, written in 2011. These are some of the way to share. People come to Detroit from around Michigan, from around the country, visitors from around the world, documentary filmmakers, and they'll have conversations. Classes will be held there from different universities. In the next 3 weeks, there's 35 Minnesota middle school kids coming for a week learning journey in Detroit to visit all these different sites that are part of this emerging. Now, I don't want to give the sense that what we're doing has changed the narrative in Detroit, because we come to Detroit at a time when gentrification is as vicious as any place in the world right now, where they want control of the water, where capitalism from 1967 to 2008 did not want capitalism. But when the crash happened in 2008, they want the water for international trade. They want the water because Michigan and Detroit and the Great Lakes are 22% of the fresh water in the world and 82% of the fresh water in the United States. That's the oil of the 21st century. They're not coming there just because they want fancy restaurants. That's having an impact, and it brings in all the middle class and gentrifiers, but that's not their main reason. They're looking at power. And this is a mural that's on the back of the house, carriage house outside the Boggs Center. That's much better up there. And this is Freedom Dreams. So Freedom Dreams is the latest creation. How are we doing on time, my brother?
We're running over a little bit, but I think folk are enjoying it. So
Okay, all right.
floor's yours.
Okay, Freedom Dreams is the latest of 3 place-based centers that we have in Detroit right now. Groups came together to purchase 40 parcels of land and have bought the land from the land bank. There's conversations that take place there. These are the 6 people that have done it. This guy, Coach Kellogg, who spent 19 years in prison. Reverend Robert Jones, who's a blues singer. Jasmine Noble, who's one of the founders of the Boggs School as a teacher. Sam Scarfield, who's an architect. And Deacon Monroe, who's from the church. People have come and gone, but we now own 40 parcels of land with the goal of creating an eco-village that's off the grid for housing for people that make under $25,000. 40% of Detroit makes under $25,000. Detroit has been through over 100,000 foreclosures, over 100,000 water shutoffs in this last 15 years. We have a carpentry shop. We're opening up a fab lab. And people are, high school kids or young people are learning skills and learning their own identity through those skills. And I know there is someone sent me a similar program initiative here. Here's some of them building some stuff, these urban gardens and stuff like that. And this was built by Sweetwater Foundation. If you want to have some fun, go to Sweetwater Foundation in Chicago website. Folks from Detroit will go there because they have 8 acres. And they'll come back and say, we've seen the future. And when people from Detroit, and I'm not talking about activists or academics or radicals, regular, quote, folk, the only folks that really will make change, go there, they see the future. And our whole concept is if you don't see the future, if you don't create the future now, if we don't create critical relationships and critical connections, the mass movements will emerge and they'll die. The question is, what happens after mass movements emerge? The second one is Burwood House. This is a community house. This woman, Kim Shirobi, was born and raised in this neighborhood. She was a public school teacher, retired now. And the middle school that she went to, she now has a freedom school at her home, where the kids will come and they'll ask the question, what is power? What is leadership? How do we create a sustainable community? It's just small numbers of people. It's not, but so they have conversations, and it's all, as I said, it's all about relationships. Let's see what you can see. So here they're basically working at the house.
One thing I would add that I think is really significant of all of this work is that it is really rooted in intergenerational conversations and relationships, and with a lot of diversity in terms of age. And that's really been important for every age to have that kind of connection. So I just wanted to...
No, thank you. This is a guy named Ron Scott. He was the leader of the Black Panther Party in Detroit that died way too young. And he was the founder of the struggle against police brutality. And he went to move from the struggle against police brutality to also the struggle to create peace zones for life, because he pointed out how much people had internalized the violence. So you had neighbor killing each other. In fact, it got so bad you'd have a neighbor who killed somebody go to the court and kill somebody else at the court, right? Or have a shootout or a fight. And he creates this concept of freedom zones, of how do you de-escalate, how do you create communities without policing, based on this theme of putting the neighbor back in the hood. And then the last one I want to talk about is freedom growers. Whoop, let's see. The two folks there is Myrtle Thompson Curtis and Wayne Curtis. He was also a founder of the Black Panther Party in Myrtle. Both were born and raised on the east side of Detroit. There's a film about them. They fought against foreclosures. And usually when people fight against foreclosures, they fight against them to maintain their community, to hold on to what they got. Their struggle against foreclosures was to create a different kind of community that has food security, that has a community without policing. And that's putting vision above being on the defensive all the time. And D-Farm, in a film that was done 10 years ago, I should have said, it's because I met a bunch of you all 10 years ago that we eventually had many conversations over these last 3 or 4 years with the rest of your team. A guy named Malik Yakini is a founder of D-Farm, which is 8 acres urban garden. There's more urban gardens in Detroit per person, people working the farms in Detroit, than anywhere in the country. Malik now, in fact today, May 1st, no, today's May 2nd, they opened up the Detroit Food Co-op. And that's a combination of all the food security movement that had been, and food sovereignty movement that had been done over the last 10, 20 years. It's emerged from that work. And Malik's Detroit Black Food Sovereignty Network was sort of the leading element. So it's moving from the urban farms of growing food to actually now distribution of local. I mentioned Sweetwater Foundation, which is folks should check out. And just some very few other things, and I'll send these resources. A vision that there's a part of the network is a visionary organizing lab by a guy named Matt Berkhold. Magazines, Riverwise magazines, there's a few here that folks will have a chance to take. We do tours, but the theory of change is based on creating liberated zones, freedom zones, islands of sanity, where people create the future, create the relationships. And in this era of rising fascism and rising counter-revolution, as well as rising amazing work and revolutionary work, we're going to need to work to move towards each other and care for each other in ways that we have not seen or been required to do. Because what's coming, how we get through it, I don't think it's a win or lose. It's not going to end quickly. And that's for a longer conversation. This is Riverwise magazine. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Freedom Dreams. which is the name of one of our state place sites, but it's a book by a guy named Robin D.G. Kelly, which is a critical book about the history of freedom. I mean, how did black folks know and understand that they struggled for freedom when they lived enslaved? Where does that come from? Where does the belief in freedom come from? No matter how brutal and for how many centuries, you can be denied that. And his history uplifts that history and uplifts the spaces where freedom maintained itself because they separated themselves from the plantations. And two, how people created culture in their own unbelievably painful periods. A new book that just came out, Practicing New Worlds, and a book called The Future is Disabled. Because they're all struggling with what does it mean to be human. Because Jimmy and Grace in the Boggs Center fundamentally say the only purpose for revolution is the evolution of humankind. And when we say humankind now, we obviously mean the planet and the ecology of all of us in relationship to the planet. Welcome to Detroit. Thank you.
Drink your water, please.
Okay.
And while you're taking a drink, I'll just say that I think you've answered most of my questions that I prepped, but we'll have a bash at some of them and see where the conversation takes us. In preparation for tonight, I've done quite a few hours research. Fail to prepare to fail, and all that. And I was astounded by a life's work of political activism and struggle. And in thinking about the questions for tonight, one of the things I thought about was what was the type of work that Penn is trying to do, and trying to orientate the discussion around that. So hopefully there's like connections that spark conversation. And in doing that and thinking about your rich history of activism, Rich, I was listening to one interview that you've done previously where you reflected on arriving in Detroit, being a student activist, arriving in Detroit, being involved in labour movement struggles, women's liberation movement struggles, the struggle for civil rights, and anti-war struggles, anti-capitalist struggles. And the people that participate in Penn come from a whole range of backgrounds, grounded in similar social movements as well, and from a range of political identities and perspectives. And I'm just wondering, what lessons did you sort of learn over the years? How do you bring people engaged in different forms of struggle from different perspectives? How do you bring them together? And how do you hold them together in struggle?
How do you bring them together and how do you hold them together? I think you let go and you let them move forward. So, and I say that because I think when I was in my early years in the plant, and I worked 20 years on the line, so I moved from the student movement of the 60s, and as a friend said to me just recently on one of these emails, he said, remember when we took over the ROTC building, that's the Reserve Officer Training Building, and we took it over for days, and it took them a couple weeks for them to call the cops, which is very different from what's happening now. Cops then, they had a billy club and maybe one gun. Cops come in now, they got machine guns and they're the military. In fact, they are the military. And I moved to Detroit with 30 other people, believing that, as was beginning to happen at the end of the 60s, to work in a factory, thinking, being brought there because of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, which was a black movement of auto workers who were doing massive wildcat strikes and taking over factories of Chrysler, and because of the legacy of the union movement. Because I thought the ideas that are in our heads from our past history last longer than the reality that we're facing. And so we hold on to those ideas. So my idea of the 30s was, oh, we're going to redo that again. Well, shit don't happen that way. Because the world has gone 50 years beyond that. It took a while to figure that out. And I eventually came to the conclusion I wasn't going to change the union. I was going to meet people in the union who would come towards some of the ideas that we were discussing. So there's a book, Revolution, Evolution in the 20th Century, that was part of study groups that people from the plant joined with me and others from this white working class community south of Detroit. And I think I came to how did I come to the conclusion that I don't think you create a master plan of how the revolution is going to unfold? I think that's another myth because the world changes too fast. And you have to go we go where the energy is at. And how does the revolution become real to folks? I think in the plant, one of the most important ways was, as I was sharing this morning with Francis, that guys in the plant who were having lots of tough times because of their male chauvinism and how they were raising their kids, when they were introduced to the women's movement, began to change, and they saw that as revolution. They became activists in the union, but more importantly, they found their humanity. And I think that's the purpose of revolutionaries, is to walk with people to help to create the space for people to find their humanity. And then also getting far beyond thinking that you're creating a coalition that will be the mass movement coalition that will bring everybody together and overthrow the state. Or protest enough marches and demonstrations, which I love. I love demonstrations, I love all that stuff. But I think it has a certain role. The question is, what do you do after militancy? What do you do after the mass movement? And that's why the concept of critical connections comes in. And if you really take the time to look at Robin D.G. Kelly's Freedom Dreams book or Adrian Ritchie's book, you'll see a concept of emergence, of an emergence strategy. Adrienne Marie Brown, I don't know if you're familiar with her work at all. So these are the folks that have come out of and in relationship to some of the work we've done. I don't claim any of them. They're just part of this network. And I think with the young people, it's about listening. We've known Julia since she was 16. We know her kid sister since she's 12. We know her brother since he was 2 years old, right? The brother's having a tough time. The younger sister's doing okay. But he knows to reach out to his larger family, you know. So I think it's about relationships, and it's creating the space of the conversations to have these intergenerational conversations that Janice mentioned, and not thinking you have to run the movement, you know, because the movement is much grander than any organization. I think it's a myth of most radicals to think that they create the movement.
I just want to share a quote, I think, that exemplifies what Rich is talking about. Words are how we think, and we love our words, especially if we have a certain perspective. So here's the whole quote. Words are how we think, stories are how we link. And it's really, as you said, listening. So I think there's a real commitment to want to hear the stories before sharing the dogma.
Thank you. Yeah. Keep going. And tell me if I don't answer them.
Yeah,
it's okay.
And doing my research, there's a phrase that I keep coming across, I keep hearing you use, and it kind of links to my previous question, and the phrase is common historical experience. And you use it quite a lot in reference to building solidarity, community and unity. And I was just sort of kind of wondering if you could share with us what that term common historical experience means to you, and how might we go about building common historical experience and creating those relationships and connections that you've just mentioned.
I think one way to share it is so I do these tours from growing our economy to growing our souls, which is part of what you saw in the but it's in person and it's going from site to site, and you're standing in front of the big building and going to urban farms and stuff. And took this friend of ours who was a comrade with the Boggs Center, who's a poet, and she was raised in the 80s generation, which meant the crack generation, which meant was very common for her father to be on crack. And I don't know what the crack situation was here, but in the 80s, it was so bad that in 1 year, 381 kids under the age of 16 were shot. 41 were killed under the age of 16. So when you talk about violence inside a community, this was not police brutality. This was people-to-people murders and violence. And part of this common historical experience is the experience that we've internalized the values of capitalism so deeply, the values of violence, right? Finally, the struggle, because of the leadership of the Palestinians, is breaking through that. We're not being silent to the violence. But actually linking that up to how much we accept violence is part of our journey to get beyond this. What's holding us back is in our humanity and our community building. So I did a tour with this friend, Tawana, and at the end of the tour, she started to cry because she finally understood the social history of why her family was the way it was. I mean, I still get sort of chills thinking about that. And that's what a common historical experience is. It's giving someone who has an individual experience, trying to figure out why the pain is so great, why the trauma is so great, to link it to the social history, and then to solutions of how do we mend, how do we at least begin to talk about it. So now everybody, pretty common to talk about trauma, right? Those are words that weren't talked about 20 years ago, right? So I think that would be one example I would use.
And we heard just a few moments ago about the importance of kind of intergenerational conversation and actually listening to young people's stories before giving them the dogma, was I think the way you put it. But there's also something, I think, more political activism, and thinking about your history of activism, particularly within factories, within the labour movement in the factories. And it was the way of engaging with racists that struck me. And taking on that role. And when we were speaking the other day on the phone, I kind of slipped into the conversation at some point how my own approach was kind of based on the words of Malcolm X and the role of the sincere white ally, as it was put, which is to go and find all the other white people they can who feel as they do, and try working to convert other white people who are thinking so and acting so racist. Let sincere whites go and teach non-violence to white people. You've engaged with a lot of those white racists. Yeah. How important are those conversations? But also, if I can pick up on our conversation the other day, you had a bit of an issue with the word ally.
Yeah, I'll do them both.
So
great. Two things. So Malcolm challenged white folks to go and organize white folks, which I think it makes total sense. And in 1969, I went to the United Front Against Fascism conference in Oakland, California, led by the Black Panther Party. And that was the theme that came out of that, to go organize. I had been doing that, 69. So a few years later, I was doing that in this white working class community. And then in the plant, it was clear that I was going to play a role, and I went into the plant. I never sort of hid my politics. I said, I'm here to be part of a revolution. And people looked at me like it was off the wall. But I didn't do what sometimes too many radicals do, which is this incremental, gain the trust of people by doing certain things, and eventually you say who you are. That was never who I was. Part of it is me, part of it is my political thinking, and part of it is probably a personality. I don't know, probably some combination thereof. And so we did a lot of anti-racist work in the plant. and what that took the form of doing the kind of discrimination grievances, civil rights struggles, and even when I was plant chairman, I eventually became plant chairman of 5,000 people in the factory at this truck plant. Would support someone being fired for being a racist if they did some really funky stuff, like put nooses around the plant or put a Ku Klux Klan hat on their thing and walked around the plant. And then would also have the responsibility to write a grievance, right? So you live in this world, right? Because they have their grievance, they have their right, but the important thing was my political, moral values statement that I was making as a plant chairman. That was in the 70s, in the 80s. This is 2024. In the election of Donald Trump, who will have a very good chance, I'm willing to even say, unfortunately, probably win the election in the United States. 50% of the white workers of the UAW voted for Donald Trump. Are they all racist? No, they're not all racist. Do they know he's a racist? Yes. Do they know he's a barbarian patriarch with all the tendencies of a fascist leader? They feel it because they're in so much pain from the world that they've lost, that they thought they were entitled to, because they thought they should be the privileged people of the world, because they made the auto industry. And the union supported that. They supported that myth. This phrase, the unions gave you the weekend? I don't know what they did here. Maybe they did here. And your unions were much more advanced than ours in the States. The unions did what they did in the United States because we were an empire of the world at that time. And we could give out the benefits. And they wanted union peace, called the Detroit Peace Contract, between the auto industry and the unions. It was an intentional movement to create economic prosperity for the United States at the expense of the rest of the world. Whether that was through the wages that we got them from the resources that were stolen from the world. And that story can go on. My point is that after 50 years, we still have an amazing struggle around racism. And I'm doing work in the suburbs now. And I don't like the phrase ally for the following reason. Ally means that I'm helping someone else get their freedom. I'm helping someone else find their humanity. You might have a tactical alliance, and that makes sense over a struggle. But I'm not in this revolution for somebody else. I'm in the revolution because that's the only way I can regain my humanity of the kind of person I want to be. And I don't think most radicals see that. They see themselves as organizers, getting the other people to be empowered. That's always another wonderful word. We're going to empower other people. You ain't going to empower shit. You create spaces for people to find their humanity. So I don't consider myself an ally. I don't like the word. John Brown in the United States was not an ally when he went to try to get guns to be involved with the freedom movement in the South during enslavement. And I think there's a different way to look at this conversation. It's not an ally to identity struggles, even though you support all those identity struggles to gain their humanity. So I respect, that's why we're now working in the suburbs a lot around something called Suburban Connections, which is focusing on how do you deal with racism in the suburbs where most white people live. Because nobody has ever done organizing among white people outside of the factories, and the factories are no longer very significant in this stage of capitalism. So that's how I'll answer.
I want to use the next question to set up a wee bit of audience participation. You've spoken very fondly during your presentation about Grace and Jimmy Boggs' work, and I just want to ask if you can elaborate on what Jimmy Boggs meant by the need for a particular type of American revolution.
There was a pamphlet that I read in 1972 called What About the Workers? And in that pamphlet, he talks about the experience of being an auto worker. So he was an auto worker at the Chrysler Jefferson Assembly for 28 years. He actually quits in 67, 68 to dedicate himself full-time to the revolutionary movement after the rebellion of 67. So he quits, he doesn't even get his retirement. At the end of the book, he raises a question. I'm going to modernize the question. What is the difference between rights of workers and the responsibilities of workers? And he asks a few questions. What's the responsibility of unions and workers to the environment? What's the responsibility of unions and workers to what they produce? Right? I mean, we just had, we have, every political leader in the United States is so happy that there's a war in the Middle East. Not everyone, but way too many, because they're increase the employment in the war industry, right? Because they're making more military equipment because Israel is using it all up, right? That makes workers happy. How does that change? I don't have a whole lot of answers, but I know that's a question we have to be asking and not just keep ignoring it and think that they only can fight for their rights as union folks. So he would say, and I would say, when teachers go on strike or university professors go on strike, what are they often doing? Or often they're asking, what are my rights and what are my needs? What are my economic, material needs? They're not asking what is the purpose of education. They're not taking the how-to tactic of saying, why don't we set up freedom schools in the community to show that we really care about education? If we want to create solidarity, you create solidarity through working together and showing you have something to offer other people besides yourselves. Even the collective self is not a large enough collective self. So teachers at the University of Michigan went on strike for 3 months to get their union. Good struggle. They eventually win. 2 weeks later, the UAW goes on strike. And I'm at a picket line with the UAW. It was my local, where I was a plant chairman of, and 25 professor teachers come from the University of Michigan. And they take a big photo op, and they put it in the magazine. We're for solidarity. I'm at your demonstration. I'm at your picket line. And I brought them all together. I don't think it mattered much, but I brought them all together. And I said, why didn't you, when you were on strike, come out to this local union and share something about anthropology, share something about education, share something about something? And I don't expect most folks to do that, but 2 of the leaders had been around the center, and they didn't have the courage to even ask that question. I'm not saying you're going to turn around at a strike, but we're not giving the whispers of a vision when we have a struggle. We're doing what has been done based on the workers' rights rather than workers' responsibility. We're not acknowledging that this is a crisis of systems collapse, of education, of every institution in this country, in our country, probably the world. I don't know about China at all. So that's another conversation. So I think it's about rights versus responsibility. And the age of rights goes all the way back to white thinking and racial capitalism's birth.
And one of the other things I've seen you think about and talk about is how 67 was a pivotal moment for you in moving away from the belief that the system could be changed from inside. It needed to be changed in a different way. And I suppose I want to throw that question out to the audience.
Oh, great.
And ask the question, I suppose, if we take that, do we believe that the system can be changed from inside? If not, how so can it be changed? And what would a particular type of Scottish revolution look like?
I'm not answering. I'll answer after 5 of you talk.
We'll be here a couple of days and he's got the answers already. So the question is, can the system be changed from inside? If not, how do we change the system? And what would this particular type of Scottish revolution look like?
So I have 3 questions.
Well, just pick one. Just pick one.
David.
I mean, I think, as I would understand the question, the problem is we're all living inside the system, right? It's not like I was on a picket line a few weeks ago with a few colleagues who are in the room tonight, and there was someone who we knew who had enough of education and said that he was going to quit the education system and get a job in the private sector. And the next question was, well, what job would you do? And he was thinking, well, maybe retail banking. And I kind of think, like, and he's a revolutionary, he would describe himself as a revolutionary. And so I think the idea that you can somehow occupy these spaces where there's capital and bring them down from the inside, it's more about, I think as Richard said tonight, it's about us changing ourselves and how we make connections to change other people through the work that we do, because we're all struggling against the system that's all inside that.
You've got a phrase for that, haven't you, Rich? Internal revolution.
Say that again.
You've got a phrase for what David's just described, changing ourselves, internal revolution. How do you use that?
Yes. My turn to say something?
No, I don't need to gather.
Okay, I want one more, then I'll respond to a few, rather than just one. You go for it.
Well, there's that book, Crack Capitalism. It's just saying, like, you just focus on where the cracks are in the system and you put your energy, you just said something about where the energy is. But it's not just where the energy is, it's where the cracks are in the system, where it's really not working, and you can sort of wedge something into that track. So, I mean, like you said, we're all in the system, so you haven't really got much choice to work within the system. Just try and find the weakest point of it and go at it.
Let me quickly, those two are close. One of the reasons I came towards Jimmy and Grace Boggs and the legacy of how they understood the crisis in capitalism was they said capitalism is, and this is this is not today, so we have to evaluate it for today. But essentially, when I went into the plant thinking I was going to be a working class revolutionary in the trade union movement, right? I guess that would have been the painted picture or whatever. I didn't understand the difference I didn't understand that capitalism was strongest at its workplace. It was strongest at its workplace because it could buy people off. It gave them what they wanted within the capitalist system, which was an economic wage, some ability to consume. It was weakest in the social crisis. So the cracks of the social crisis. Education, kids were dropping out. Healthcare was terrible. Young kids were having babies at very young ages. Violence was ridiculous. They were the social questions facing us, right? So a lot of our work for the 70s and 80s was in those social questions. Then came the Reagan period and the deindustrialization period, which began to challenge this economic relationship between economics and what we would call the cultural social questions. We also made a distinction between, yes, we all live in the system. I made more money in profit sharing as a union leader than my father made in a year. So we live within the system. But we also made a distinction between our politics, our work, our life, our politics, and our job. Jimmy would say, one of my favorite quotes, you could work for Bank of America and spend the rest of your life working to figure out how you can overthrow capitalism. The fact that you work and do good work is important, and it gives you soul, it gives you spirit, but it doesn't define you. The larger question is your politics, your relationships, who you are, defines you much more, I believe. And so I think the difference between, there's a Charlie King song, sort of, He's like a Pete Seeger from my generation. Pete Seeger a little older. And he has a song, "My life is more than my work, and my work is more than my job." The fact that your friend's leaving that depends what he does, or she does, you know. I stayed in the plant probably for many weird reasons, which are deep psychological reasons as well as political reasons. But fortunately, the social ones were, I kept bumping into people that, when I questioned why I would stay in the plant for 20 years and do absurd work and get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, was I continued to grow intellectually and grow around the work that we were doing. Yeah.
Did your hand go up earlier? Yeah, I thought your hand went up earlier. Did it? No?
It's me.
Yeah.
Sorry, actually, because I don't have my glasses, so I barely see anything. So, no, but I'm gonna say
Good,
something.
go for it.
Just in case. No, regarding your question and the interventions before, well, there's always been this debate between like changing the system or overthrowing it, or building alternatives, which is a little bit about what we've been talking today. And maybe we don't need to choose one. I mean, we should be supporting both. I'm not saying reforming capitalism, but it's true that there's a kind of dilemma. In my case, I come from Spain, so some of the social movements also decide to go to elections and to have representatives to try to change some things. So there's some kind of reform. I mean, they probably know they are not going to change or overthrow capitalism because they form part of a government, but still there are energies that we use from activism that go there. So I don't know, maybe we have to, I mean, the emergency, I mean, it's big enough to be in all the fronts. Of course, we can choose where we put our energies, but I don't know if we should renounce to one or the other. And also, I was really curious, you said something that, for me, that I'm from a country that still the social movements have been fighting for the public, in a way, for public ownership of resources. And I guess in the US, maybe it's more oriented towards community ownership, or I don't know, but you said this thing that because of gentrification, or well, because of the dispossession, if you want, of the people, or in order to have freedom spaces, to put it in other words, first we need to have spaces, and that's something that we are losing very quickly. That's, I mean, for us to just keep a very small venue in my city to be able to meet together with the social movements, we need to put a lot of money personally to keep it open. And what is publicly owned, I mean, is kind of every time more difficult for us to get. And lots of the buildings, spaces are being bought by financial international funds, and also there's this imbalance in between different European countries, which also makes our spaces very expensive in the south of Europe for the locals, blah, blah, blah. We could talk a lot about this. And you said that some of you, or you bought collectively some of the spaces in order to build things. And well, I just wanted to ask you about this tension in between who can save money to put it together, to buy and to take back the resources and to put it into service for the community. And if that's really an option, do you think that? And the tension with fighting for it to be public.
Definitely a large conversation. When I think of Spain right now, I have to uplift the Fab City movement. You're familiar with the Fab City movement? So in Barcelona, about 8 years ago, Barcelona, and I don't know how it's advanced or what the conversations are at this point, they made a commitment that 50 to 60% of everything that's produced and all services used in a city would be locally energized. They got everybody from China to Detroit to sign on. The significance of it is always questionable when people do this, but it comes out of fabricators and the new stage of technology we're in, which was also another significant part of Jimmy's early writings, where he talked about, for the first time in human history, 1963, when he wrote his book, The American Revolution, he not only said that the rising numbers of people in the working class will no longer be the paradigm. But what will be created is the outsider class. Now in the United States, the outsider class meant people that didn't have jobs, that were, this is 40% of Detroit, that get Medicaid or get social services, that don't have jobs anymore. Or now we can probably say they may have jobs, but they're working 3 jobs in the United States. And he said this is happening because of automation, which has turned out to be a truism and is going to go beyond what we can imagine in terms of AI, right? We don't have a clue how bad it's going to get, let alone who controls it, but the technology itself and what that does to how people are going to live. And therefore, it's people who are outside of this economic system that are the basis of a social force in a place like Detroit. A place like Southside Chicago, small towns in the United States where there used to be one factory towns. The deindustrialization that took place across the United States, other parts of the world. I don't really, what you're saying I agree with. There are many streams to how change is going to happen. I don't know the relationship between them all. I wish people the best of everything they're doing. I can only do what I'm doing, where I put my heart and my time, and fundamentally will look back or look at even the other struggles that are, if you have a coalition that's against police brutality and your answer is more cameras, and you know they don't work, or more training, and you know they don't work, you're not working within the system. You're working to uphold the system. You know, if you're not educating people to be healthy and figuring out how to get people off of diabetes, you're not working with the system to make some things better. You're keeping the system going to keep people sick. If you're helping people be educated so that they can become successful in America and be materialistic and buy more cars, you're not helping people. Basically what you're doing is perpetuating the system. Does it mean you vote or don't vote? Yeah, we're going to face that in the United States. We got a neoliberal barbarian, what is his name, Biden? And we got a fascist. Tell me the difference in their policies. President Obama, which was a great leap in the United States to have a black president elected, no question about it. And there's no question that health care, finally black folks and poor folks can get colonoscopies, was a big deal. But he was not the president of our movement, he was the president of the empire. So it's not about working within the system or outside the system, it's a question of where are we going? And how do we in these neighborhoods show other people and ourselves? We have to show ourselves because we don't believe in ourselves. We think somehow feudalism ended, and everybody woke up and said, let's create capitalism. There's a system out there. We'll go from feudalism to capitalism. That's not how it happened. People made step-by-step decisions over hundreds of years. That's the only message I can share, that it's going to take a long time, and we have to ask questions that when we know the answers to the old questions, then we're not asking questions that really matter.
Just conscious of time, and I've really, for myself, only got one more question that I really wanted to ask. And it's about cultural representation and about self-representation. So we saw from some of your brilliant slides the role that art plays. There's even an artist, a decent artist sitting over there, I might say. And I was just wondering, like, when you think of the role of popular culture, you think of the places you've lived, the struggles you've been part of. In recent kind of times, we've seen films such as 8 Mile represent Detroit. We've seen films such as The Trial of the Chicago 7 come out to represent the oppression of the system of people who were protesting in Chicago. We've even seen documentaries that have been produced, like A Requiem for Detroit. But thinking about the work of the Boggs Center and some of the art-based stuff that we saw earlier, how important in terms of imagining alternative futures, imagining where we're going, doing that work now, how important is cultural representation, those forms of cultural representation in imagining?
I mean, the simple answer is it's critical, it's essential. Artists, visual, spoken word artists, poets, capture in 3 minutes what I might talk about for 2.5 days. I'm sure they do it in 4 minutes, but so the gift is what they bring in their own particular forum, their own particular platform. But I also want to point out the contradiction. So Detroit's gentrification that's happening right now, which is really, really painful for people who have lived in the community, people who never left, who could not leave. When we started doing murals back then, they were the uplifting of what's possible. They were the uplifting of community kids doing all of this stuff. They did it for free, even. They didn't have to get paid. Eventually, they get paid, and that creates another contradiction. But it's also a different generation, and they need money in ways that our generation could have 5 people live in a house for $100. Right? You can't do that now. So things change, and we have to adjust. But now what you have in Detroit is the system, the powers to be, will say, I want to resurrect and reform and change an old building. And it's called a Community Benefits Agreement. And there's a train station in Detroit that was built in, I don't know, 1910, 1915 maybe. Beautiful, sort of like some of your beautiful buildings here, you know? And Henry Ford's Ford Motor Company bought it. They're creating something, a mobile center, not a mobile center, right? It's gonna have all the high tech. Eventually it'll have a road that doesn't use cars, that just has a person that goes from their headquarters to the center. And it's in an area of southwest Detroit. They got $500 million from the city and the state. And one of our friends is responsible for creating a democratically created, community-run mural. 10 years from now, you know what that's going to be? A whole bunch of gentrifiers, conquistadors, living in this area saying, wasn't it so nice that the community did this for us? That's what murals have become. When you get the powers to do what they're doing and they give you a crumb, and they did it with the Jefferson Assembly Plan, where Jimmy Boggs worked for 28 years. They just got $490 million. And we had to struggle with them to try to talk about a vision for the community that would be sustainable. What we got was almost nothing. We didn't get solar for the community. We didn't get internet for the community. We didn't get de-escalation of violence committees in the community. The workers got their jobs. My friends in the UAW got their jobs. Okay? Detroiters got their jobs, but as soon as they make enough money, they're leaving Detroit because there's no reason to stay in Detroit. So we're not doing anything other than sort of at this point raising those questions. And I want to be clear about unions, since you're doing some stuff on unions, and others are. I think it's very exciting that people are being seen by their unions and are organizing. Also don't see a whole lot of responsibility among the membership to deal with this racism, to deal with this international solidarity. Does the leadership do some of that? Yes. But having been in a union for all these years, will it change significantly? We'll see. I'll keep my eyes open. But it's not going to be a union movement in the 30s. The industrial movement's not coming back. You know? So, because it's this rights to responsibility question.
Nyla, do you want to ask the last question?
What are you doing to prepare your community for Fascist America, and what can we do to prepare here?
I'm glad you're getting the question, Rich.
I'll share a story. I start with, I don't think any of us were in the United States, other than black folks' history of enslavement and the violence, and that's not modern memory, obviously, have any sense of what's possible. I don't have a clue. I'm glad we're all signing hundreds of petitions and calling for united fronts, and everybody's yelling and screaming and trying to protect the students who are protesting in Palestinian freedom and every major university in the United States. And that's part of the struggle, because that struggle will mean that these young people will become, some of them will become real leaders and grow in a way of how people grow, right? I mean, I went to Chicago in 1968 for the Democratic Convention, working for a candidate for peace, got involved in the streets, ended up coming out saying the system is broken and I'm not going to work with trying to elect anybody. I got involved in this journey that you got a little sense about. We were on a phone call about a month and a half ago with some comrades in a small town in upstate New York, about 30,000 people. And they're doing similar work to us, small scale. Excuse me, small scale. And they have a collectively owned co-op laundromat. This black woman who's responsible for it on Martin Luther King Day. So we're having these conversations. We had these conversations with other people in the network. In a similar way, we had conversations with our dear friends here, every few months, and just talk about what's happening in your area, what's happening in our area, what are some questions we're asking. And the conversation started, so these are folks from from upstate New York, and our comrade Myrtle, who you saw from Freedom Growers, says, and this is a woman who, if Malcolm X was a woman, this would be her story. What she's been through in her life, and eventually, hopefully, she'll write her story. She said someone knocked on her door from another farm and said, let's go for a walk. Just out of the blue, just knocked on the door and said, let's go for a walk. And then this woman from Kingston said, on Martin Luther King Day, for the first time, the laundromat had people dancing and singing freedom songs. And she felt alive. And she's felt the purpose of why she was doing this laundromat. And what we could, after sort of a 45-minute conversation, it became very clear that it's those relationships that we create that will get us through this next period. What's going to happen in policy and government is bigger. I mean, I've never seen, and I'm not that bright, but I've never seen countries stop fascism before it happens. Maybe you have. I don't know a lot. But I've never seen that happen. And we are in a period, I'll sort of sum up, of a rising fascism and a rising counter-revolution, rising revolutionary movement that will take many forms. And we won't even get into the discussion of what the global challenge means in terms of China and the US destroying the rest of Africa. So I don't have a clue what you would do. Maybe you're all strong enough to overthrow your government and make sure nobody, well, you can't control you can control your police, but not the military, right? So I have no idea what you can do. Maybe you can, I'll go back to what fascinated me about our conversations was, I mean, similar to Puerto Rico, It's not enough to call for independence. So what does independence look like that's different? So in Puerto Rico, this little solidarity thing that folks went to, our comrades in Puerto Rico, they have created communities that are self-sufficient, regenerative, and will they be strong enough to overcome the gentrification in Puerto Rico? I don't know. We'll see.
One word,
Sure. Thank you.
the way.
So we can stay longer after, but for those that want to leave, since it's that time, the way that we end is we go around and everybody just says one word. And before you do that, because that'll be the ending, I'll end with another tradition, which is when we had national gatherings, which were very small, 100 people. They weren't big organizations. Jimmy Boggs would say, each of you is so precious for the fact that you came here and you're spending time here. And look at each other and figure out how you're going to take care of each other. And have no regrets for whatever you do, because they're only lessons. So everybody goes around, one word, who wants to start?
You can pass if you
And
want.
you can pass if you want, it's not a class. And if folks want to talk.
Can I be provocative and ask
Oh.
Jeff to say the first word? Given that Jeff roped me into doing this tonight.
Oh,
Well, thank you for
yeah, wonderful question.
beautiful questions.
Yeah.
Let's hear it for our
Right.
friend.
Friendship.
So we just go around. Not a test.
Solidarity.
Memory.
Say,
Memory.
Science.
Oh. Openness.
I was also going to say solidarity.
okay.
Respect.
Reflection.
Love.
People.
Thank you.
Venceremos.
Home.
Connection. Independence. Network.
Relationship. Interconnected.